we'll transition from the NFL and the NHL over to the college basketball side of things here. Bring on Ed Feng from the Power Rank. Ed, how's it going today?
It's great. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, man. Appreciate your time. As always, good to get you back on the program here. I think this is a really good time to take a look at the college basketball futures market because college football done, NFL, 3 games left to go. We're kind of in that transitional period where people are starting to pay more attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good time. And I think a lot of the teams that we kind of expected to be there are still going to be there towards the end of the year. I'm talking about the Dukes and the Michigan States of the world. But I think there's some other teams that are kind of flying under the radar, and I'm pumped to talk about them.
Yeah, and that's the big thing here is that when you look around college basketball this season, it feels like there isn't a dominant team. I mean, Villanova certainly has looked very dominant at times. They're 16-1. They lead the AP Top 25 and the coaches poll, both by pretty significant margins. Number 2 is Virginia. We know Virginia plays great defense there in Bennett's system, but they're not a sexy team. They're not a team that people really like to follow, really like to pull for because they don't score a whole lot. They'll play games in the 50s, and they don't really care. Purdue, Oklahoma, Duke round out the top 5. So you've got some usual suspects, at least over the last few years, Ed. But in terms of a dominant team, I know that you do your own numbers, your own metrics, your own models. Do you see a dominant team out there on the board?
Yeah, I mean, probably not. All the talk up here in Michigan is about Michigan State and how this team sucks now and Michigan's better than them, which I find to be completely false. I think that team is super talented. I think they're going to be there, like I said, at the end of the year. They're just going through a bad spot, and college kids are going to go through a bad spot. That's just going to happen. I still think you got to look at Duke as a pretty serious contender, and Nova. But I think parity is great. And parity is also a good thing when you're looking at futures markets because, instead of maybe, in years where there's not a lot of parity, I think you can look at like 4 or 5 teams that have a legit shot at winning the tournament. I'm talking about the year Kentucky went undefeated heading into the tournament. There were really only 4 or 5 teams that could win that tournament. I think we're going to find more this year, and there's going to be more, and I think that's exciting for everybody.
Before we look specifically at some of these teams here and get some of these futures prices that are on the board, I do want to ask you about how you put together, I don't know if you have personal power ratings or if you just, spit out a team grade based on some of the statistics that are out there. What do you incorporate into your formula for evaluating these teams?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basics is my team ranking, and this looks at the game result of games, and it looks, in particular, the easiest version is it looks at margin of victory and adjusts for strength of schedule. So Duke gets a bump because they play a better schedule in, the ACC. Big Ten teams are getting a little bit of maybe a drop from strength of schedule adjustments just because the Big Ten is down this year. But the idea is that, we can make adjustments for the big conferences and the big teams that play a lot of good competition versus the MAC teams that may not play as good a competition. The second thing I put in there is market data. I look at closing point spreads for every game that has a spread. And again, I adjust for strength of schedule with the same ranking algorithm that I've developed. And this is it's a pretty interesting metric in both college football and basketball because you get a little bit of that preseason weight in there. Clearly I weight games last week way more than I rate games from November, but you still get a little bit of that. Wichita State's probably a good team. You get a little bit of that more in these market rankings than you would in a straight database data from this year type rankings. And then the last thing I use is, might be surprising to some people, but I use the preseason AP polls. I've done some work with preseason polls and found them to be remarkable predictors of postseason success. This is something that Nate Silver and Ken Pomeroy did first, but they found that the higher ranked team in the preseason AP poll predicts about 71, 72% of tournament game winners, which is a pretty good rate. And the idea is that you get kind of wisdom of crowds. So it's not that any one sports writer has a perfect poll, but when you combine about 60 of them together or however many there are in the AP poll, a lot of the small errors cancel out. You get a pretty powerful predictor. So this has a lot less weight than the other 2 factors that I mentioned, but it's still something I use because we want to remember that, Michigan State's still a good basketball team. We don't want to forget that. We want to remember that, well, Arizona's probably a little bit better than their numbers look at this point in the season. And so that's what this preseason poll does for my stuff.
So let me ask you this here, because, we know that the futures market is pretty fluid. I mean, these prices are changing based on results of individual games. For example, if Clemson beats North Carolina tonight on the road as a 6.5-point dog, their 300-1 number, 5 dimes, which I think is high to begin with, is certainly going to go down. When you beat a team like North Carolina, people take notice, and it also helps, from a selection committee standpoint, helps strengthen your resume, that type of thing. So let me ask you about this, Ed, because we have these times throughout the season. We've seen it countless times in college basketball. You mentioned Tom Izzo. Tom Izzo's teams in November generally aren't great. I mean, they're pretty good. They're obviously a team that could be in the top 5, top 10, whatever. But by the time that team gets to March, I mean, they're a well-oiled machine, and everybody knows you don't want to play Tom Izzo in March. So let me ask you about a team here, kind of an off-the-wall example a little bit, Texas A&M. So this is a Texas A&M team that opened the season blowing out West Virginia. They beat them by 23, went on the road, beat then number 10 USC by 16 points, played right with Arizona in a 3-point loss. Now they find themselves on January 16th, winless in SEC play. They're 0-5. They play Ole Miss tonight. Maybe they get that first win. So how do you account for that, in terms of your rankings in your system, to where what Texas A&M was early in the year is clearly not what Texas A&M is right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think those things are really difficult. I think we kind of, I think maybe the common fan really expects a team to play the same throughout the entire season. That's really not the case, especially in college sports. And it's really hard to kind of adjust for that. I mean, I'm looking at my numbers here, and I have Texas A&M 25th overall. So these would be the ensemble of the 3 things that I talked about earlier. When you're just looking at points, they're going to be a little bit lower. I mean, my numbers see this as a very good defensive team. They're 10th in the nation in adjusted defensive efficiency. So that means they can really play some D. They're 81st on offense out of 351 teams, so not as good on that side of the ball. But, it's tough. And, when you describe a team like that, you really, I mean, I'm fully in favor of watching games to get a feel for teams. I feel like often that can be misleading too, but especially for a team that's been up and down like Texas A&M, that's where really digging into the tape can help.
Well, and what's so interesting about a team like Texas A&M too is that, this is a team that was, I think they were as high as 6th or something like that in the poll. So their futures prices gradually went down. Actually, not even gradually. They went down sharply early on in the season. Now you find Texas A&M as a 66-1 shot at 5 dimes. They're 50-1 over at BetOnline. Texas Tech is 50-1. Xavier is 60-1. Seton Hall, Michigan, 80-1. And then you got a bunch of teams in the 100-1 range. So, it's really interesting to me to see a team like Texas A&M sitting there with a medium range price when they're not playing like a medium range team right now. I mean, right now, even with those wins over West Virginia and Southern Cal, I mean, you can kind of make an interesting case about what their tournament profile looks like as they're 0-5 in conference play. And they've got a long way to go, and they may scalp some ranked wins and stuff like that. I mean, they almost knocked off Kentucky on the road a couple of games ago. But, that's one of the things that you want to pay attention to as a handicapper out there. And I know you know this, Ed, but I'm speaking to the listeners here. Pay attention to a team's stock, their current stock, and also where their ceiling can be, because you can find some futures value as a result.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I feel like we'll talk about some teams, I think, later on, and I'll try to give everyone a little bit of a feel about how to get team ceiling, because one thing that's really random in college basketball is three-point shooting, and that's a way you can kind of tell whether a team is under or overperforming.
All right, let's look at some of those teams here. And right now, as we talked about, there's really not a standout team. I mean, there are 3 teams that are probably better than everybody else. That right now looks like Duke, Villanova, Michigan State. The top 3 on the board at 5 dimes. Duke at 5-1, Villanova plus 535, Michigan State plus 550. If you look over at BetOnline, Michigan State is plus 700. I think Duke I just saw was plus 600. Same thing for Villanova. So you have this situation here where you've got 3, I'm going to call them chalky teams. I mean, obviously you're not laying juice on them, but they are the clear 3 favorites here. Do you feel like there's any value in those teams at all at this stage of the game?
I really don't. Those, the top 3 teams, especially when it kind of gets broken down the way that I do it. I mean, I have Duke number 1. They're about, actually about a half point ahead of number 2 Nova. And So they're going to be about 16, 17%-ish to win the tournament. And that obviously depends on, how it breaks down, what their bracket looks like, and whether all the other teams end up on the other side of the bracket. But, that's roughly where their odds are. I mean, 6-1 is going to be an implied odds of about 14%. So there's not really a ton of value. And I think Michigan State and Nova are kind of in that same boat. I think the chalk is pretty much where it should be and not a ton of value there.
All right, so what about the second tier? Who for you comes, right below that Duke, Villanova, Michigan State type of group?
Yeah, I think we've got to talk about the Purdue Boilermakers. This is a team that's excellent on defense. They're actually fourth in my numbers right now. Kind of, outside the top 10 in preseason expectations, but a team that numbers-wise has been a definitive top 5 team. They are excellent on defense. But one of the things that I look for with these top teams on defense, their three-point shooting defense. So if you see a team that has reasonably good 2-point defense, so what I do is I look at 2-point field goal defense and I adjust for strength of schedule. When you see a team that has a good 2-point defense, like maybe 32nd, but an exceptional 3-point defense, like maybe first or second in the nation, that's a team that's likely to regress. So a team that has really – there's a lot of randomness in three-point shooting. And even the best college basketball teams on defense aren't necessarily going to be able to hold every team to, below 30% from the three-point line. So for example, Texas Tech is really high in my numbers. You could think that they're maybe a team that you want to find some futures values. But when you look at their numbers, they're 32nd in 2-point field goal defense, which is very good. And this is clearly an excellent defensive team with Chris Beard as a first-year coach there. But they're only allowing 30% from three-point line, which is 13th best in the nation. I mean, that's exceptional, and that's probably not going to continue going into the future. That's not necessarily the case for Purdue. I mean, they're actually third in 2-point field goal defense. It's a heck of a team. They got the shot blocker Haas back there. That makes everything very difficult. But they're allowing about 32% from three-point range, which is 44th in the nation, and that's probably about right for an excellent defensive team. It doesn't seem as much of a statistical. It doesn't seem as much of an aberration as a Texas Tech that I mentioned before. So I really see Purdue as a team with a lot of value. I'm seeing 20-1 at BetOnline. You can kind of question whether they're going to continue to hit over 40% of their three-point shots on offense, but they got a lot of guys that have done it over the last couple of seasons. Dakota Mathias, one, and I think it's an excellent team. I saw them play here in Ann Arbor last week. It was a game that went down to the wire. This team really gets after it defensively, at 20-1, I think there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, they're plus 2150 at 5 dimes. So again, that speaks to what I'm talking about in terms of shopping around for the best price. I actually got them back on January 3rd at 40-1. So I'm really, really happy with that grab. That's certainly some good value there. And one thing, I think it's a good time to bring this up as well here with, a team like Purdue. And you mentioned the Big Ten is down a little bit in terms of a conference. So, maybe when Purdue runs into one of these elite level programs from the ACC or, a top team from the SEC, something like that, depending on their draw in the tournament, can be problematic. But the thing with futures, Ed, is that it's great if you win. It's awesome if you pick the winner. But it's all about using that as a vessel to guarantee profit. So if you can get a team like Purdue at 40-1 like I did, as opposed to 20-1, gives you more hedging opportunities. And that's why you always want to be looking for these prices out there in the futures market. And that is something that is just remarkably significant, is being able to get as much hedging value as possible. And from what it sounds like, you still think that there is some value there with Purdue at 20-1, not just in terms of winning the tournament, but also as a team that can make a deep run and allow you to hedge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, 21 is about implied odds of 4.8%. Obviously, it would be better at 40-1 like you got it. But, yeah, no, I mean, I think I would, as the fourth-ranked team in the country, I would estimate that their win probability would be 8 to 10%. So, yeah, obviously that depends on the draw, but I think that's a team that has significant value.
All right, who comes next then for you where, maybe there is some futures value, maybe there's not?
Yeah, there's one team I'm looking at, North Carolina. I'm seeing them at 33-1 at BetOnline, and this is clearly a blue blood program, very good, going to be future Hall of Fame coach. They, in terms of my rankings, are 8th. So they're in the range of a team that's going to have maybe a 2 to 5% chance. Well, actually, probably a bit more, probably like 5-ish% chance to win the tournament. But the one thing that I like about North Carolina, and I want to get back to that randomness of three-point shooting, on defense, North Carolina, by my numbers, is the sixth best in two-point field goal defense. But they're 285th in the nation in three-point field goal defense. So they're allowing almost 38% of three-pointers to go down. That's a lot for a good defensive team, especially for an athletic, long team like North Carolina. That's something you expect North Carolina to allow a better three-point field goal rate on defense. And so I think, by the end of the year, we may not be talking about them as the eighth best team. We might be talking about them as the fifth best team in the nation. And then, a team that could maybe get up to 5, 8, 10% chance to win the tournament by the time we're in the field of 68.
I think that's a good one. I think this is probably a good time to grab North Carolina because as you look at their upcoming schedule, there aren't a whole lot of landmines. They're a pretty decent favorite tonight against Clemson. They'll beat Georgia Tech. At Virginia Tech is a little bit of a tricky game, especially with the quick turnaround. But, that is a game that they should win. North Carolina State at home, rematch with Clemson. They play Duke February 8th. So in this span, it looks like they've got the opportunity to improve that record a little bit, possibly move up the ACC standings. And look, this is a team that lost at a neutral to Michigan State, lost at home to Wofford after winning on the road at Tennessee with Ohio State on deck. So that was a pretty bad sandwich spot for them. I mean, there's no excuse if North Carolina loses to Wofford, but you can kind of soften the blow of that defeat. Lost on the road by a point to Florida State, lost on the road at Virginia, which is something a lot of teams are going to lose to, or something a lot of teams are going to do this year. So I think the buy side is probably on for North Carolina right about now.
Excellent. Love it when we agree, man. That's great.
All right, so let's move on then down to, I guess we'll sort of move to that 6 line that you have there. Who comes up there?
Sorry, the 6 line?
Yeah, in terms of your personal team rankings.
Oh, yeah. In terms of, so we are at, so I actually have Kansas at 6 right now. They've been looking better as of recently, and obviously a little bit more of that preseason weight. Virginia at 7th, North Carolina at 8th, West Virginia at 9th, and Wichita State at 10th. I think these are all teams that, Kansas is probably the most surprising one of any of those, and that is going to be more of kind of the early season market weight and then just expectations that a guy like Bill Self can get it together and will get it together heading into the future.
All right, so let's talk about Kansas here, and I'm going to group Kentucky in here, and we'll do that in a second. For Kansas, they lose those back-to-back games to Washington and Arizona State. And the Washington loss was clearly not a good one, especially with what Washington looks like this year. That Arizona State loss, at the time didn't look particularly great for them, losing by 10, giving up 95 points. We've kind of found out that Arizona State's a pretty damn good team. Lost to Texas
right.
Tech. Again, we found out that Texas Tech is a pretty damn good team. So, of the 3 losses that Kansas has, 2 of them are against teams who look a lot better at this point than maybe they did when they beat Kansas. And we're kind of finding out why they were able to win those games. So is it possible that Kansas, being a blue blood type team out there at, 20-1 at BetOnline, 15-1 at 5 Dimes, is that a team that has some value now?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they have value. Like, I'd like to see them kind of move up a little bit more. I'd like to see more from them on the court. Well, maybe. Because, at 20-1, they're going to be about 5%, 4.8%. And if I have them about 6/7, that they're probably 5 to 7% to win. So maybe if it's for me the numbers, it isn't like a strong pull to say Kansas for a future, but it's one of these things. If you kind of know this team and you know about the talents of this team and you see future NBA stars on there and the type of team that can really make a March run, it might be a good time to grab it at 20-1.
Now let's talk about Kentucky because you have another blue blood type of program here, obviously losing athleticism because that's just what happens there in Lexington. A team that's 14-3 with losses on the year to Kansas, who we just talked about, UCLA, and then also a loss at Tennessee. This is a Wildcats team that blew out Louisville by 29. No one talks about that game at all anymore. It's almost like it didn't even happen. Kentucky, though, at 20-1, the same type of price as a Kansas team. whose stock seems to be rising, whereas it kind of feels like people are looking at Kentucky saying, well, this isn't the same Kentucky team that we've seen in the past. So that feels like a complete and utter stay-away team right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like in my rankings, I have them at 18th. That is the type of range where you kind of need a miracle to win the tournament. So, I mean, I don't think it's by any means you want to give up on this team yet. But, if you're picking between Blue Bloods, Kansas, or Kentucky, the numbers are definitely pointing towards Kansas at this point in the season.
All right, let's talk Wichita State. Wichita State moves from the Missouri Valley to the American Athletic Conference, so they do take a step up in quality. Cincinnati's a very good team. Houston's a pretty decent team. Memphis and UConn tend to get some pretty high-level talent, even though they haven't necessarily had the results over the last couple of years. SMU has fallen off a little bit, but still, top to bottom, this is a stronger league than the Missouri Valley. So from a Shockers standpoint, Ed, what does that mean in terms of how you adjust to strength of schedule? Does that move from the MVC to where they were blowing people out to the AAC help them in terms of, the way that you view them, or has it hurt them thus far?
Yeah, I mean, my system should be completely neutral to that, in the sense that, if you move to a better conference, but your average margin of victory is 2 points, whereas in the Missouri Valley Conference, your average margin of victory was 30 points, you're still going to look better in the Missouri Valley where you're really blowing out teams. I think Wichita State, does that make sense? Like, it should be neutral in my numbers, whatever conference they are. That should all be in the numbers. I have them at 10th. I think that's about right. They're probably a little bit better of a team. I haven't had a chance to watch them yet this year, but I'm looking at their offense and defensive breakdown. They're 14th on offense in terms of adjusted points per possession, 29th on defense. Expect a little bit better from that program on that side of the ball. So we'll see what happens going into the future.
Well, that's a team right now 14-1 at BetOnline, plus 12.25 at 5 dimes, and it certainly seems like there's some I guess I would call it familiarity bias with that team in the sense that their price is just way too low right now based on what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also feel like if you're looking at that price preseason, that's probably somewhat reasonable. I mean, that's 6-7% to win the tournament. I think we may be talking about that team in those terms by the time we get to March. So, it does seem a little bit crazy now, but I think it'll be fine. It might be fine by the time we get to March.
Now, this is something that kind of plagued Wichita State a little bit, in terms of being in the Missouri Valley, like I talked about, in that, they just don't play a high level of competition in the regular season. Now it's a little bit higher being in the AAC, but obviously the poster child for that is the Gonzaga Bulldogs, who are out there in the West Coast Conference, where it's basically Gonzaga, St. Mary's, BYU is, serviceable, and sometimes they'll pull that upset. But, overall, they're not a particularly great team. So what do the numbers say right now about Gonzaga, who currently out there in the market, 25-1 at BetOnline, 22-1 at 5 dimes? What do your numbers have?
Yeah, I mean, my numbers have them at 12th. And I think this is a perfect example of just whether you're blowing out teams versus letting them stay in games. Gonzaga was first in essentially all the points-based metrics last year because they were really putting the hurt on teams in the West Coast Conference. And when you adjust for strength of schedule, your system should really capture that. I thought they were a little bit overrated heading into the tournament last year, even as a top-ranked team in the nation. I thought North Carolina was on a similar level as them. But this year, they're not putting the hurt so much on those West Coast Conference teams, and so that's why they're a lot further down. Obviously, a program that is going to be there, I think, in March. Even being in that small conference. But I didn't grab their price. But at 12th, they're going to be on one of those outside. Not one of your primary contenders to win going into March. So you're going to need a pretty big price on a future to want to take that right now.
Yeah, like I said, Gonzaga 25-1 at BetOnline, 22-1 out there at 5 dimes. And what's interesting here is St. Mary's is 33-1 at BetOnline, but they're 100-1 at 5 dimes. So again, one of those things you really want to shop around for. Like I sort of mentioned with Clemson earlier, where they're 300-1 at 5 dimes, they're 100-1 at BetOnline. All of this stuff matters because actually it looks like they're down to 275-1. So maybe someone's listening to the show and went ahead and hit that one there with Clemson, but all that stuff matters, especially from a hedging standpoint, because you give yourself a lot more leeway. So, Ed, as we sort of wrap this thing up a little bit here for today, are there some teams out there that we haven't talked about where you feel like there's some good value on them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we talk. The two I like the most right now are Purdue and North Carolina. We talked about them. We talked a little bit about Texas Tech. It's one that the numbers suggest have value, but I think that value is going to disappear as the season plays out, just because they've allowed such a good field goal defense from three that it's just not something I expect to keep going into the future. I suspect that, they'll be a tournament team. They may even end up in the top 10, maybe in the teens somewhere. But I think, at 25-1, it's just something that I think the numbers don't suggest. So, definitely a team I'm keeping an eye on, and, maybe in the future we'll think differently about it.
I guess I will ask you one more follow-up question here, and I don't know how much you dabble in the futures market. I know that obviously you're using your numbers on a day-to-day basis when it comes to handicapping, but I think one of the most difficult things is to find a buy point team, like when you want to enter the market and get the most possible value. Because, like I said, let's say that you like North Carolina. We talked about them as probably being a team that you want to go out there and get at 30, 33-1, whatever the case may be. If they lose tonight to Clemson, which, like I said, they're only a 6.5-point favorite, it's certainly a possibility. Or they lose one of those games I mentioned. They slip up at Virginia Tech. They lose at home to North Carolina State. Maybe lose that game to Clemson. I don't know how much their futures price changes from 33 that it is now to whenever they played Duke. I think it was February 8th, I said. But obviously it could go down if they slip up and fall in one of those games. So do you sort of have a feel for that? Do you sort of have an idea of when you want to look and when you actually want to lock in a team?
Yeah, I think my approach is you want to lock in a team that has, maybe not one of the top three probabilities to win the tournament, but one of the contenders. I talked about at the beginning that, in the quote unquote bad years, there's going to be 4 or 5 teams that have a legit chance of winning the tournament. And I think we're in one of those good years where it's going to be, maybe 7 to 10. For me, it makes sense to try to get in those 7 to, one of those top 10 teams to get a future, because you have a legit chance. And maybe if they don't even win, you can still hedge at the end of the day. That's how I think about it. It's really rare that, UConn as a 7 seed ends up winning the tournament. So with that, you're really hoping to strike some magic. And I just think that's, the prices are high, and I think you're better off just with a team that's going to have you're better off looking at a top 10 team with some value as opposed to a top 20 team with some value. I just think in the long run, you're going to end up better off that way.
Sorry for keeping you.
It depends on your appetite for risk too, right? Because the Connecticut's as a 7 seed do sometimes win. I guess I don't have that appetite. So it kind of depends on where you feel, what your appetite for risk is.
Well, and that's the thing, and I'm sorry for keeping you here, but I keep thinking of follow-ups. And one team I've been looking at here is Oregon at 250-1, because, this is a team that lost a ton from last year, but I trust Dana Altman to get them going in the right direction. I don't know if they're going to have a tournament caliber resume by the time we get to that point. I sort of feel like at 250-1, it may be worth a shot, especially with the style that they play, knocking off a team or two once we get to the NCAA tournament. But one team I did throw a little bit of money on at 500-1 was Middle Tennessee State, who went to the tournament last year, made a little bit of noise. There is some risk involved, though, in that they may get an at-large, but they probably need to win the Conference USA Conference tournament to make sure. Yep. Is that something you totally avoid then, even with what looks to be a pretty healthy 500-1 shot?
Yeah, me personally, I would. I have Middle Tennessee 52nd in my numbers right now. I have Oregon 53rd. It just says the data over a half-plus season does not suggest that they have, a shot at even making the tournament, as you said. So those are I would personally stay away from those teams.
All right, fair enough. Ed Feng from the Power Rank. What's going on over there at the website right now, man?
Yeah, I'm doing some NFL playoff previews, working on my podcast, the Football Analytics Show, getting some guests and talking and breaking down games. And then once the NFL season's over, I'll be getting ready for March Madness and telling people about how to win their pools.
And you can follow Ed on Twitter at the Power Rank. Ed, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us, man. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.